I am going to be talking about resiliency through conflict. And what I mean by that is we're really talking about how we can use conflict to build our resiliency as SLPs. And I would tell my students all the time that what you want to be is a willow and not an oak. And when you think about an oak, you think about that strong tree that stands up against the winds. But what happens when a really strong wind comes along? That tree breaks. It gets toppled over by the roots. But if you think about a willow, which is a smaller tree, but it's a little bit more resilient against high winds, against storms. And so rather than thinking about we need to be that oak when we're faced with conflict, we really need to think about being more of a willow. So our objectives are to define conflict resolution and management and understand the difference between those two. I always talk about resolution versus management. Management just means that you've stifled it for a time. It doesn't mean that you've come to any conclusion or any resolution. And it's really important for us as communication disorder specialists to develop that resiliency when we're working with students, when we're working with other professionals, because oftentimes we're in the middle of a conflict and we're not quite sure what to do. And we're also going to talk about, what are those strategies? What does the research tell us about strategies for conflict? Because what we want to be able to do is to not only introduce, but also improve. I think, did she drop off?
Yeah.
It stopped, huh?
Okay.
Did
Welcome back.
everything stop?
Yeah, everything stopped. Yes.
I told you it's called technology. All right, let me see if I can share this again. All right, how about now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so I had asked a question before, and you can either unmute or if you want to drop it in the chat. What's resiliency? What do you consider as resiliency? Anybody want to just take a wild guess? There is no such thing as a wrong answer. So what's resiliency to you?
I would say being resilient has to do with being able to overcome extreme difficulty, even though it's not expected. Um, and also, not to say it doesn't prevent like hardships or stress. It means being able to adapt to challenges.
Yeah, that's a great definition. The simple one is being able to bounce back, right? Being able to face that adversity and then to bounce back stronger than before. And that when we take a look at identifying those elements, we're really talking about the idea that we want to be able to face those challenges. We want to learn from our mistakes and to be committed to learning from those mistakes. When we think about resilience, we also think about personal control. What do we have control over in this conflict situation? We want to think about permanence in terms of, again, making sure that this conflict is not just managed, but also resolved. And resiliency allows us to build a level of persuasiveness, perseverance. And we want to personalize that resilience so that it's impacted because all conflicts are different. All conflicts, it depends on whether it's a conflict with a family member versus a conflict with a colleague, versus a colleague versus a conflict with someone who is higher up. And so when we personalize that, we're really thinking about how we're going to impact our life as well as others by doing by building that resiliency through conflict resolution. When we think about conflict, conflict is incompatibility. And when you look at those definitions, it really is values, needs, goals, interests, actions. A conflict can be any of those things. It just means that two people or even more than two people are disagreeing about something, and that what we want to be able to do to move forward is to resolve that conflict in good time. So what we know about conflict in terms of in healthcare and in education is that it's really common. And that most of us, and I say us because I'm one of those people, would want to ignore it or confront it in a manner that's going to lead to personal attacks and prevent future collaboration. So in other words, I would blow up. I don't know about anybody else. If it was a conflict, it was either my way or the highway. I left a job once because of conflict. And then I began to just ignore it. Okay, it'll go away, or it really doesn't impact me. And so therefore, I don't have anything to do with this. But what I found is that by stifling that, by ignoring it, or even confronting it, it won't resolve the issue. And it prevents people from collaborating with you further. Conflict doesn't always mean confrontation. And I think oftentimes we confuse conflict with confrontation, that we have to get loud, that we have to demand that somebody make, a quick decision. And what I'm going to talk about today is that sometimes that conflict is not going to resolve itself in an instant, even though we want it to. It may take some time. When we look at the view of conflict, most people fear conflict. I don't wake up in the morning and say, I'm gonna have a confrontation with someone today. And that when we do have conflict, oftentimes we're not at ease with it. We're not confident about it. And so when we think about resolving it, then it's typically not in our comfort zone. And I know, I went to school back in the dark ages with, oil lamps and horse-drawn carriages, but that was not something that was addressed in my course of study. They didn't talk about how you would have parents that would be demanding things of you that were outside of your scope of practice, how you would have to fight for space in a school system, or you'd have to fight for your turn at the table if you're in a medical situation. And, they didn't address that. And so we were often placed in situations where there would be a conflict, a professional conflict, and not know what to do about that. Anybody have any of those conflicts? That you might have, have addressed or come across?
Be a conflict with me because I teach in the college, so sometimes they might be a conflict with a clinical educator, and we just have to talk it out to find out how can we resolve the problem. Mhm.
How can this be resolved? Because
Yeah.
our typical reactions, just like, our reaction to fear, right? Flight, fight, flop, which is a new one that people have come up with, or friend. We now want to make them a friend. So we're bringing cookies and we're bringing all these other things because we want to ease that tension that might happen because of conflict. But conflict can be beneficial. Although, when I first started doing this, I'm like, no, it can't be. But it can, because what it can do in situations is to instigate change. Some things have been going on for a really long time. College situations, school situations. We've always done it this way. It reminds me of Easter program at church. Sister Jones always did the Easter program. And if you tried to make any changes with the Easter program, there'd be conflict, right? But it can instigate that change. It can also be a source of feedback. Maybe you might be looking at things differently now, because you are involved in that situation. We know that if it's unresolved, what it can lead to is negative relationships. And people being non-productive because, well, why should I work with them? Because they're just going to disagree with me anyway. And so what we want to do is to look at conflict as a way to improve relationships, and by going through the steps that might be involved in doing that. When we look at conflict as an organization, then we're looking at 4 different ways that conflict can be categorized. So it can be intrapersonal, right? It can be interpersonal. It can involve, individuals. It can involve a group. It can involve people within that group. And so when we're looking at how that conflict manifests itself, we really have to think about how we're going to manage. Is it one person, or are we really looking at a conflict that's occurring at a higher level that maybe we want to be able to address? When we look at conflict, again, people often might view conflict in that negative manner, and so they can't really see a positive outcome. And that's that belief that prevents that positive outcome from happening in situations of conflict. People look at it as, again, it's a conflict. One person has to win. And so if I don't win or if you don't win, there isn't any reason for us to have this conflict. But it really is, Vivar talks about in his article, that it does develop new solutions, and it really does develop trust, because it means that we as an organization or we as individuals can talk through those situations, as Terry mentioned, and come to some kind of resolution versus just management. So when we know, when we, take a look at resolution versus management, if we're just managing it, then it's not going to give us a good outcome. It's going to rear its head on another day. And that we know that conflict is inevitable. And really what we want to think about is how we're going to handle this, because we want that outcome to occur. When we think about that resolution, it allows everyone involved to access information, to take a look at the perspective from someone else's point of view. It really does involve self-reflection, which we don't think about when we're in a conflict. I don't think about how I'm being viewed by this person. I'm only looking at how this person is acting or reacting to what it is that I'm saying. Conflict resolution allows for me to have thoughtful actions, and it may not resolve itself right that day, but it's going to allow me to improve my communication skills. Maybe the conflict had to do with the way that I was communicating information to this person, or the way they were communicating to me. And so what we want to do through this resolution is to improve those communication skills so that it won't come about again. When we look at styles, it relates to our personalities. It relates to the way that we were brought up. It's cultural in a lot of ways. And the way that we approach conflict has a lot to do with the way that we might have approached it in the past. And one of the things we want to think about with conflict resolution is changing the way that we might have approached it in the past. So Vivar talks about 5 different kinds of styles in conflict. And in other articles I've read, they kind of attached it to animals. You know how they, give an animal that particular style. So as I'm going through these, I want you to think about, okay, what style do I usually use when we're talking about conflict? So the first one is avoidance, and they use the turtle as an example. The turtle faces conflict by pulling his head in, and avoidance is I zig, you zag, right? So we're not going to come at this in the same direction because I'm going to avoid whatever you're going to do or whatever the group is going to do, because I just really don't want to deal with that. It's too much. When we think of another way, it's the fox, which is compromise. You bend and I bend. Now, compromise is not a bad thing, but it doesn't necessarily resolve the conflict. Because if I'm bending and you're bending, we may not be bending in the same direction, right? We may just, I'm going one way, you're going the other way, and it might cause a harder or more difficult conflict if we're just using compromise. Um, Concession means, I lose, you win, or I win, you lose. And they use the teddy bear as an example that if somebody gives up, or if I give up, then I'm going to build some resentment about that because it means that I was not heard, that somebody didn't hear my ideas. And when we take a look at competition or competitiveness, it's the shark, right? I win, you lose. And I'm going to come in there like gangbusters because I want to make sure that I'm heard. I'm not going to listen to anybody else's because my way is the only correct way. And then there is collaboration. And they use the owl as that example, the wise old owl who sits in the tree and who observes, moving their head from one side to the other, taking in all of the information that's being presented so that in the end, both of us can win. I win as well as you can win. An owl doesn't move quickly. If he sees prey in the grass, he's going to watch and see where they're going. Again, collecting all of that information. So which style are you? I like a little bit of interaction. Which style are you when you think about how you deal with conflict?
I'm a combination. I'm a
Okay,
combination. I think in my family, I handle conflict, I guess coming from a really large family, more competitively. I need
okay.
to be heard.
Yeah.
But at the
Uh-huh.
workplace, I think I'm more compromise and collaboration.
Okay, okay. Yeah.
I have
Anybody
to,
else?
yes, I have to agree with Daria. I'm more like, yeah, compromise and a collaboration. I think I've
Okay.
grown a lot because I used to be an avoidance person.
Ah,
Yeah.
all right.
So I
Yeah.
think I've
Yeah.
grown. Yeah.
Yeah. And collaboration, Chang, Yan, and Moeller talk about this as integration, right? An integrating style is the most effective. So each party has to give a little bit. You have to give a little bit in order to resolve the issue that might be taking place. Um, that's an important aspect of what we're going to do when we're talking about resolving this particular conflict. Again, with compromise, if you're going to build a resentment after you've compromised, then it really hasn't been resolved, right? That it's been managed, but it hasn't been resolved. So we want to think about what style it is that we're going to take a look at using, integrating aspects of all of it so that we can come to some resolution with this particular problem. So it is you want to attain your objective, and it's through
Oh,
that open dialogue.
excuse me.
What is open dialogue?
Excuse
What
me,
does that
Sam.
mean when we are addressing each other?
Yeah, we
Yes,
did have
Terry?
we do have some people who stated we have Cassandra. She says she's avoidance and
Uh-huh.
collaboration. And then Latavia, she stated that family avoidance, work, and collaboration and compromise.
And compromise.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Collaborate, collaboration is one we want to work for. Integrating, in terms of that, cooperation is something that's really very, very important. One of the difficulties with that is that we want it to happen. I'm going to stop using the word you. I want it to happen immediately, right? So I'm cooperating. I'm collaborating with you, and the conflict doesn't get resolved like tomorrow. And I have to remember that if I have not obtained all of the information, if I have not gathered all the information that's necessary, then we really can't come to some kind of resolution with that particular conflict. So it's important to think about gathering information, which we're familiar with, right? When we're working with our students, we have to gather all the information that we can before we can make a really good decision about where to go with that particular student. And sometimes we might head off in a direction that we find out is not the right way to go, mainly because we haven't gotten a lot of that information. And it's the same with any kind of conflict. We want to not pretend that it didn't happen. We don't want to keep on, moving forward and get stuck. We really want to stop and take a look at what's going on so that we can gather that particular information. So what do we need in order to do that? Well, we need listening skills, and we all are SLPs, ideologists, and we say, well, we have listening skills. But one of the things that is missing from that statement about listening is the term non-judgmental. And in my mental health first aid class, I talk about listening non-judgmentally. Why is that aspect important? Why is that non-judgmental aspect important? Anybody want to take a guess?
A defensive person is going to be less willing to engage in some kind of resolution to the issue. And if they, determine that you are judging, or if you're, coming at them in a negative way, then they'll be less willing to engage.
Yeah, exactly, Stephanie. Exactly. That non-judgmental means I have to close off all those buttons that can get pushed when somebody is talking to me about something, and think about it from the perspective of, okay, am I really hearing what they're saying? And if I don't, then I want to use those questioning skills that we have when we work with our clients. What more information do I need? How can I question it so that they don't feel like they're being picked on? How can I question it so that I can say, I hear you, but I'm not quite sure what it is that you mean, gathering that information. Communicating non-verbally is all a part of listening. Our faces say so much more than maybe our words do. And that when we are using that non-judgmental listening, we also want to make sure that our body posture is one that is accepting of the information that's being presented, which is hard to do. I'm not going to say that any of this is easy. It's difficult to think about that. We had a family reunion this past weekend, which was wonderful. My sister and I and my daughter were pretty much in charge of it. My sister is very much a type A personality. She is, minutia, and I am not. My daughter is more minutia than she will admit. And so there's some conflict that was occurring there because we weren't all on the same page. We weren't communicating with each other. And when you bring in other family members, that can be disruptive as well. And so we always had to make sure that we were checking in with each other. So if I saw my sister is a teeth, she grinds her teeth, and you can tell that her jaw is really tight. And so that was her nonverbal. And I had to check in with her and say, hey, what's going on? And then listen to what it was that she was saying, not giving her an answer immediately, but just allowing her to vent rather than grinding her teeth. So watching that nonverbals. And then what do we do with mediation? How do we mediate if we're working, especially with a group? What are those skills that we need in order to do that? Listening non-judgmentally is the first one. And the other one is not giving advice, but really thinking about, okay, what are the choices that we have here? How do we weigh those choices so that it's beneficial to everyone, rather than saying, well, this is what you ought to do. What we want to say is, okay, what are our options here? And any option is open. We can put it all out on the table. And then if we're discussing it, we're questioning it, then we can eliminate those that may not work right now, but maybe will work, in the future. Again, giving the family reunion this weekend. My sister had lots of ideas, which were great ideas about the things that we could do. And she had a schedule about, doing X, Y, and Z. Well, people didn't want to do that, and they demonstrated that in a number of ways. So how do we mediate that? Yes, Terry.
We have Latavia. She stated that you can be empathetic and everyone's guard is down
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to the
Yep.
skills needed.
Yeah. That's, and understanding that people that are in this conflict, all have human emotions that they're experiencing. You know, you're not alone in feeling that conflict. And really be kind to yourself when you're thinking about, okay, I really, you know, this is something that needs to be resolved. I'm really reluctant to resolve it because that might put the spotlight on me, and I don't want that spotlight on me. But if I give myself grace, we talk about that a lot, and think, okay, unless it's a 911 emergency, I have some time to gather some more information, to discuss some things with other people before we can come to that resolution about that particular problem. You know, being what's the new meme about mindfulness and something else and demure? Isn't that the one? Anybody? Am I the only one that watches those TikTok videos? But we do want to think about that. You know, we want to think about what are those strategies that we might be able to use. And if we don't have them, then what can we do to improve them? You know, can we take a mediation course? Can we read books on mediations? There's tons of YouTube videos and TED Talks that talk about those things that we can do in order to improve our mediation skills so that we can come to that resolution. So before I move on, I just want to make sure that I have everybody's comments.
Okay, we do have Stephanie. She stated very demure and very mindful.
And Mary Mindful. Yeah, yeah. Those are the things we want to think about. So when we're looking at that resolution, the first thing we want to make sure is that we have an accurate framing of the conflict. What actually is this conflict about? And that, again, is one of the hardest parts that we can do. Is it a third party conflict? He said that, she said that, I said that, you said. And so the information, like telephone, has been diluted or added to, throughout all the different people. So what is the problem? And can we identify those people that are stakeholders in this problem? Who is this going to impact? And then taking a look at what's the solvability of this problem and what's the value that's going to be claimed as we resolve this conflict. So if we frame it, we're thinking about what's the actual source of the conflict. Is it misinformation? Is it misinterpretation? Is it that there hasn't been enough information gathered and we're trying to make a decision based on that lack of information? And so once we can really identify that problem, then we can move forward when we're thinking about conflict. Oftentimes, a conflict can erupt, be disruptive because it hasn't been accurately framed. On a lot of the speech pathology Facebook pages, right? People are writing in about this teacher did X, Y, and Z, or this parent said X, Y, and Z, and the principal and the this and the that, and so there's a conflict. And when I take a look at those in my head, I'm asking questions like one of the biggest ones that I've seen lately are people being moved out of rooms in schools. They're being put in custodian closets and things like that. And so, my first question is always, well, what are the rules within your school system as to space that you need to have? Have you checked those out? What are the state rules and regulations? ASHA is a certifying body, not a legal body. So they can write guidelines, but they don't have any legal, they don't have a legal foot in this. That's the state law. And so do you know what the state law is? And can you go to the administrator and say, according to state law X, Y, and Z, my space needs to be, this big, this long, I need to have access to. And so therefore, I will not be doing therapy, in the janitor's closet or behind the bathroom or other places that, people have been placed. So you have to have that information and identify, what that problem is. I had a friend who had gotten ill the last part of the school year, so she wasn't able to pack up her room, and she went back about a month and a half later, and the principal had thrown all of her stuff away, everything, her records, her materials, because the principal had decided that they were going to use this room for, some other reason. And because the SLP hadn't packed it up, she was just going to throw it away. Now that's a conflict. That's a big one. And instead of um, uh, Laura going in there, guns blazing, which would have been me, she went and got the rules about record keeping and the fact that this person had thrown away records that were legal documents that should have been kept for 7 years, and that they were thrown away, so that's the legal aspect of it. And two, she presented her receipts from the materials that she had purchased with her own money, and then went to the school, to past records to find out materials that had been purchased by the school that, again, this woman had thrown away. And she went to the principal first and said, what you did was against the law. Um, um, uh, you can be sued because we now don't have those records. And then there's the matter of materials. Well, the principal kind of blew her off. So she went the next step with her information in hand to the superintendent. And that went before the school board. And the conflict was resolved because the principal was punished for throwing away legal records because the school board knew that was going to be a big if. And Laura was reimbursed for the materials that she purchased, and the principal also had to reimburse the school system the materials that she had thrown away that belonged to the school system. So if she had gone in there, with guns blazing, how dare you, yada, 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 instead of saying, here are the legal ramifications that you are going to face because of what you did, because of your actions. And then when that didn't resolve the conflict there, she had to move up that ladder. So we have to think about that framing, how do we frame this and what's the information that we need to have? We have to think about, is this going to be a problem that has a solution? It may not. It may not have a solution. Can it be solved today? Nope, may not be able to be solved today. So what we have to decide as the individuals who are having this conflict, do we need to regroup and reconvene? And when we regroup and reconvene, what's the information that we need in order to see if this problem has a solution? What are we missing here? So let's turn this into a discussion about what's missing. What's the information that's missing that we need to have in order to make sure that we can resolve this particular conflict. And then who's going to be affected by this dilemma, right? In the situation with my friend and the principal, who's going to be affected? Well, all the students are going to be affected. All the students who have an IEP or who are on a 504 are going to be affected by this dilemma because now she has no records. They weren't backed up in the computer that was going to be worked on, right? The previous years. And so we really have to talk about these stakeholders and then what's going to be the negative and what's going to be the positive. Because his principal was like, well, you can just develop something because you remember all those kids. Well, no, that's a negative outcome. That's going to impact the children. It's going to impact their parents. It's going to impact, the legal liability of not following that IEP. And so that might be the discussion before we can even come to a resolution. Who's going to be affected by this particular dilemma? And we also need to talk about the value. What's the motivation behind the desired outcome? Why is this a conflict? Is it a personal one? Is it a professional one? Is it someone that's their feelings got hurt and now they want to make this into a huge conflict? Can the value be created? Maybe we're not sure about what the value is. So maybe that first step before we can resolve it is to think about, okay, what's the value? What value are we going to create here? If you're doing push-in therapy, I refer to the schools. I don't have a lot of medical experience, so anybody that does have medical experience, if you want to jump in here. But in the schools, I want to do push-in therapy. How is this valuable? Well, it's valuable for the student because it allows them to practice those skills in real time. It's valuable for the other students in the class because now they can understand what this student is working on, and maybe be a little bit more mindful of their responses when they are talking to this particular student. And what we're doing then is working together, to define that desired outcome, and collaborating. How can that collaboration occur? So before we can even resolve it, maybe what we want to think about is, okay, what's the value? What is it that we're trying to resolve here? And we also have to remember that, if I'm uncomfortable with conflict, that other person could be uncomfortable as well. And they might show it in a different way, whereas I might get quiet, go to my room and not say anything, and they might get loud and confrontational, but they're uneasy about it just as I am, because again, nobody really likes conflict. But if we can come to a shared value, then maybe what we can do is work together and look at those obstacles so that we can build and maintain this resiliency through that particular conflict. There really are three conversations when we're talking about conflict: the what happened conversation, the feelings conversation, and the identity conversation. And when we are talking about resolving that conflict, we want to think about what kind of conversation is happening. Is it a what happened, right? The disagreement is about what happened or what should happen. And what we have to think about there in that conversation is, the three sides to the truth, right? There's your side, my side, and there's the truth. What are the intentions when someone is disagreeing? And then are they playing the blame game? It didn't happen because you didn't. Rather than thinking about, okay, this resolution is both of us have something to do with what's going on here. How can we address this? How can we address what's going on? When we take a look at the feelings conversation, what we're looking at is that self-evaluation. Are my feelings valid? Are my feelings appropriate? Should I acknowledge those feelings that I'm having or deny them? Well, if my feelings are valid and my feelings are appropriate, then I need to acknowledge them. And I need to let you know, using those I statements, when you do this, I feel this way. So when you interrupt me when I'm talking to a parent, I feel less valued. I feel as if my, professionalism is at stake here. And so when we think about those difficult conversations, their core really is about feelings. How I'm feeling about this person interrupting me, how they're feeling about information that I'm given that maybe they hadn't heard before. And why didn't I come to them with that information before I presented it in a family meeting, like if, at a medical center when we're talking about releasing a person from the hospital, and the OT and the PT had never heard the SLP side of it, you know. So those difficult conversations really are about feelings, and we have to do that self-analysis for that. And with identity, when we're talking about, that identity conversation, it's that internal debate about competence. Was I good in this? Did I make the right decision? What's my image going to be like? Oh, what's it called now? Oh, and now I can't remember. It just escaped me. People are talking about uh, not having good self-esteem. It escaped me. It just left my head. In terms of, I don't really know what I'm doing, even though I've been to school and I've taken all these workshops.
Imposter syndrome.
Yes, yeah. Thank you very much, Stephanie. I could not think, it just went out of my brain. But that kind of thing, is that what's happening here when I am thinking about my identity? What does this conversation say about me in this particular situation? How are people going to approach how I say it? And I know I have to work on my tone oftentimes. Are other people like that too? I have to work on my facial expressions. My children say that if my smile doesn't go past my nose, it means that I'm upset about something or I don't know the person I'm talking to. So they've read me. They know what's going on. So I have to take a look at myself and say, okay, is this conflict because of my, self-image or my self-esteem? And am I going to be a hero or a villain? Sometimes, right? You are going to be a villain because your conflict is with information that's been presented in a larger group that you don't agree with, mainly because all the information hasn't been gathered. Or you might be the hero because you might bring up information from a communication perspective that nobody thought about before. When we're looking at some of our individuals like geriatric population, having been through this with my parents, we know medication can drastically impact their personality. It can impact their behavior. It can impact their communication. And so maybe people in this conversation about where this individual needs to go next haven't thought about the fact that, well, have we taken a look at the medication that they're taking? I know for my dad, he would take a particular medication and he would have hallucinations. Um, but because when he wasn't taking it, he was fairly lucid. They didn't believe us, his children, when we said he really shouldn't take that because he's calling my mother at 3 in the morning because he's seeing little green men. They didn't have that information because he never told them that. So am I bringing that information? So now I can be a hero in talking about, well, here's some information that you didn't have. Maybe that might change the outcome of what this conflict is. When we're talking about dismissing people from the hospital back to their home or into rehab facilities, do we have all the information that's necessary for us to know that? I'm a storyteller, and we got 10 minutes, but I want to tell this about my father in communication. He really was having some difficulty. Again, he had diabetes, poor blood flow, et cetera, et cetera. And they would come in the hospital every morning and say, Mr. Childs, how are you today? And do you know what day this is? And he would tell them the day. And do you know where you are? And he would tell them where he was. And, do you know why you're in the hospital? And he would tell them why he was in the hospital. And then as soon as they left, he would turn to my sister or myself and go, you know, now tell me what today is. He was answering those questions. He was reading the board, the whiteboard that's up on the wall that gives you the location and your room number and who your doctor is. He was reading that when the professionals came in the room. And he would forget to read it, when anybody else was asking him that question. So he had figured that out. So again, we have to take a look at all those things when we're talking about resolving that particular conflict. I always laugh about that. So what we want to do is to move towards a learning conversation. What we want to do is not to just prove a point, not to just give them a piece of my mind, not to just get them what it is I want them to do, but we want to really think about delivering a message so that everyone can learn from that particular message. We might want to change our stance. We want to invite other people into that conversation. We want to invite somebody to help us figure things out. We want to invite the person to understand from another perspective. Have you thought about it this way? So tell me, when you have been in the room with this individual, what is it that you see that maybe other people have not seen? And those are those conversations that we want to have because those are learning conversations. What we really want to have is a backbone, to be flexible, not to be that brick wall that we can't change, but also not to be that jellyfish and just give up. Because what we have in this conflict is information that's beneficial and that can be used. So we want to have a learning conversation where we're bringing in different information and perceptions to the table. Not, I know all I need to know. I need to persuade them that I'm right, but really thinking about exploring all the stories, how we understand the situation and why the situation might occur, right? Bringing it all to the table. It's more complex than maybe anybody can see. So we may not be able to resolve it right then. Maybe we need more information. When we think about our feelings, right, we're not going to avoid talking about those, or we're not going to erupt, but we're going to think about how I'm presenting myself Do I know what I'm feeling right now? And thinking about doing that without judgment and acknowledge those feelings before solving the problem. Here's how I'm feeling about this. I'm feeling unheard. I'm feeling as if my professional judgment is not being considered here. And so bringing that to the forefront and saying, I'm working on those things. Can I have some more information before we go into doing that problem solving? When we're looking at that identity conversation, I can't just protect my self-image, all or none, but I have to think about the fact that none of us are perfect, that we're all complex. And so what we want to think about is what are the identity issues that are on the line for us when we're talking about solving this, and to really work on myself to build that more complex self-image, to maintain my balance better. What support do I have? If we're talking about going against IDEIA, then I've got the law, right? If we're talking about making me do things that are not within my contract, I've got my contract. And so I can utilize those things to come to that table to help resolve those particular issues. When we're practicing that resiliency, again, practicing awareness, what's going on around you. What mistakes have you made in the past when we've addressed conflicts in other ways? And choosing your responses. I can tell someone, in a heartbeat, I'm not really ready to discuss this right now. What I need is some time to gather some more information. And once I gather that information, can I shoot you an email and we can set up some other dates to discuss this? Um, Learning to relax, which I don't know about anybody else, but relaxation is really hard when you're in a conflict. Setting goals for yourself. Okay, how am I going to address this person? Do I need to practice my conversation with somebody else first? Um, Develop strong relationships. Who else can you get that might see things the same way that you do? Not that you're ganging up on anybody, but you're gathering that information so that that conflict can be resolved. And think about being flexible. Again, being that willow and not that oak. Maybe I might have to bend a little bit here, or maybe a lot, but the overall option is to what are the values that we are trying to address, and what are those things that we really want to consider when we're talking about that conflict and building that resiliency. We want to prepare, you know, establishing that trust, avoiding making assumptions, decreasing barriers to communication. When are you available? I want to plan. What is the conversation that I want to have? What might be the result that I want? And am I able to negotiate that response? And then my execution is, what's the management style that I'm going to use? And am I able to pivot? If somebody presents other information that I hadn't considered before, boy, am I able to go, oh, okay, well, I hadn't thought about that. And so maybe I can pivot, in that particular direction. I always want to remind people that when you're, doing conflict resolution, you have to have a self-care plan. If your cup is empty, you can't fill anybody else's cup. And so you do want to be mindful. You want to remember that you're not alone. You want to be kind to yourself. So what is that self-care plan that you have? Is it written down? Is it something that you say, okay, this is what I'm going to do now because I know my cup is empty. And before I can address this particular issue, I really need to fill my cup up so that I'm able to establish, to plan, and to prepare. So be a willow as we are building that resiliency, as we're going through that conflict. Again, remember you're not alone, and that you can build that resiliency through that conflict. All right. Oh, I'm good. 3 minutes, right? Are there any questions that you might have? If you want the references or if you want the PowerPoint, here's my email. And you can just shoot me an email and I will be happy to send you that PowerPoint. This is one of my favorite pictures. This was in Botswana, Africa. And I just love the sunset. So this is one of my meditation pictures, that I can take a look at when I'm really